Hello, welcome History 6-7 to what is essentially a wrap up of much of the topics we have learned about. This will be essentially an overview of the history of eugenics. It'll talk about its origins and its legacies. So, for our agenda today, we're going to talk about the origins of eugenics. We're going to talk about the sterilization programs that came about from eugenics. We're going to talk about the complicated history of eugenics and birth control. We're going to talk about the impact that eugenics has had on immigration. And then to wrap it all up, we'll talk about how American eugenics actually inspired Nazi German eugenics. And then we will talk about how American racists reacted to Hitler when Hitler copied our eugenic programs. So let's start at the beginning. So in 1859, Charles Darwin publishes his groundbreaking works on evolution. Almost immediately, many of Darwin's followers start to apply his ideas of evolution to human beings. This idea was known as social Darwinism. And for our lecture, one of the biggest social Darwinists was this guy, Francis Galton, the cousin of Charles Darwin. He introduced the idea of eugenics into scientific discourse. He advocated for systematic incentives by the state to encourage the English elite to marry as early as possible and beget numerous offspring. In this way, the so-called number of excellent could increase from generation to generation. So Galton's first work on eugenics was this one, Hereditary Genius. This book sought to answer the age-old question, was intelligence a hereditary trait, or was it the product of their environment? Galton's conclusion was that intelligence was always inherited and never taught. Thus, if intelligence is a hereditary trait, then it stands to reason that so-called stupidity must also be a hereditary trait. As Galton best put it in Hereditary Genius, the best form of civilization in respect to the improvement of the race would be one in which society was not costly, where incomes were chiefly derived from professional sources and not much through inheritance, where every lad had a chance of showing his abilities and, if highly gifted, was enabled to achieve a first-class education and entrance into professional life by the liberal help of the exhibitions and scholarships which he had gained in his early youth, where marriage was held in as high honor as in ancient Jewish times, where the pride of race was encouraged. Of course, I do not refer to the nonsensical sentiment of the present day that goes under that name, where the weak could find a welcome and a refuge in celibate monasteries or sisterhoods, and lastly, where the better sort of immigrants and refugees from other lands were invited and welcomed, and their descendants naturalized. Emphasis on the better sort of immigrants. So, after publishing Hereditary Genius, Galton did not stop. He continued to publish more works, and this work in particular was important. This work was called Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development. And this work right here was where Galton coined the word eugenics. Fun fact, that's actually the scrap piece of paper that the word eugenics was appeared for the first time. In this little scrap piece of paper, which Galton was writing as he was submitting his book for publication, like many other sciencey words, Galton derived the word eugenics from Greek roots. So let's break the word down. Eugenics. So eu was the Greek root for good, right? Or well. Like euphemism, good saying. Euthanasia, good death. Euphoria, good feeling, right? So eu meant good. Then you had this root, genus or genix. This meant born, come into being, or growing or grown. So when you put the word eu and genix together, you get the word eugenics, which literally meant well born. So eugenics was essentially the study of the well-born and the practice of propping up the well-born. So there are two types of eugenic practices out there. The main form of eugenics that Galton advocated for was positive eugenics. Positive eugenics sought to increase, elevate, prop up so-called desirable offspring. It didn't concern itself with weeding out the weak, but encouraging the strong. So how does one achieve a positive eugenic result? Well, you could enact a policy of forced birthing, forcing people of a desirable stock to keep pumping out babies, even against their will. You could have policies of family planning. You could also incentivize the immigration of desirable races to make certain countries more ethnically homogeneous. And this was the form of eugenics that Galton advocated for, positive eugenics. One infamous example of positive eugenics in action is this one. This was the Nazi Lebensborn program. This program was essentially, for simplistic sake, a baby factory. So in Nazi ideology, the Aryan mother had a very sacred role and a sacred obligation towards the state. The Aryan mother was viewed as the bearer of the Aryan race. Her goal was to produce more and more healthy, well-born, and able-bodied Aryan Germans. And fun, or not so fun fact actually, it's a pretty dark fact, but a dark fact about this was that this was drilled into the heads of women at a point where their goal should be to have as many children as possible. In fact, if you were an Aryan mother and you had at least 6 children or more, you would get this honorable award called the Mutterkreuz, or the Mother Cross. It was this badge of honor that you got from the Führer himself. And this was because you were fulfilling your obligation towards the state, and that was to be a bearer of the Aryan race. So that is an example of positive eugenics, because it sought to prop up a desirable group of people. And in this case, that would be the Aryan race. But there's another form of eugenics that exists. And it is here where eugenics starts to take a much more American turn. This practice was negative eugenics. Negative eugenics sought to decrease, get rid of, undesirable offspring. It concerned itself less with harvesting the good wheat, so to speak, and more so with detaching the wheat from the chaff. So, how does one achieve a negative eugenic goal? You could enact forced abortions as opposed to forced birthing. So, if you were a person of an undesirable stock, you would be forced to have an abortion. Or better yet, you could be forcibly sterilized. That is, being permanently unable to have children ever again. So if you were an undesirable person, you might lose your ability to have children. You could also segregate so-called defective genes into prisons, insane asylums, and so on. You could also enact very tough immigration quotas to keep certain racial groups out. Basically, a policy of strong borders. Or you could just kill them. Kill them all. Kill every last one until no one is left. Men, women, and children. And whereas Galton may have coined the word eugenics, he did not necessarily espouse negative eugenics. Rather, one of his followers came up with this practice. One of his American followers. This person was Charles Davenport, the father of American eugenics. So Davenport was an avid reader of Galton. He actually wanted to take Galton's ideas further by making eugenics into public policy, because Galton's work, while it was influential, the British government at that time did not actually enact his ideas into public law. In fact, Galton himself was somewhat skeptical of his own ideas. But Davenport believed that it was essential to enact eugenics public policy laws. Because to him, the world itself was at stake if the menace of the bad blood was left unchecked. So whereas Galton wanted the desirable people to breed more, Davenport wanted undesirable people to breed less. And so Davenport would ultimately make eugenics more distinctly American by systematically wiping out undesirable peoples via forced sterilizations, forced birth control, and immigration restrictions, and eventually maybe even a little murder here and there. So Davenport would begin American eugenics at this place right here, Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. Now today, Cold Spring Harbor specializes in genetic research, but it owed its origins to eugenics. Back then, the word genetics and eugenics were synonymous with each other. Back then, when you often said, I want to be a geneticist when I grow up, you often meant, I want to be a eugenicist when I grow up. Because the purpose of genetics at that time period was to serve the eugenics cause. Eugenics sought to understand the human genome, to identify good genes and bad genes, to better the human race. Much like, I would argue, the modern day Human Genome Project does. Now, Davenport would create this lab and serve as its leader. And it was here, at Cold Spring Harbor, where American eugenics would be born. And one of the most important branches of this laboratory was the Eugenics Records Office, or ERO for short. Now, Davenport didn't go about this eugenic endeavor alone. He had help. And one of his biggest forms of help was this guy, Harry Laughlin. He was Davenport's right-hand man. And he served as the superintendent of the Eugenics Record Office, established at Cold Spring Harbor in 1910. He drafted numerous templates of eugenic-based sterilization laws that could be implemented across the American states. He also was the guy who drafted numerous immigration restriction laws and immigration quotas. Now, like many other quote-unquote academic endeavors, eugenics had its sponsors. And it just so happens that many of these sponsors were some of America's wealthiest capitalists. Some of these people you might even recognize. The Carnegie Institution of Science. This institution was one of the biggest sponsors of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. Oh, oh, my bad. So, yeah, Carnegie Institution of Science. Because the Carnegie Institution's goal at that time was to sponsor academic research to better humanity. Now, on the surface, this isn't a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing for billionaires to be donating to society. But the type of research that Carnegie was donating to was somewhat questionable. Now for our next sponsor. Wait, is that a woman? Yep, that is Mary Williamson Harriman. She was the wealthy widow of E.H. Harriman, a powerful railroad baron. She donated over $500,000 to the Eugenics Records Office. Then you might know this guy, the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefellers sponsored eugenics not only in America, but even in Germany. In Germany, the Rockefellers sent millions of dollars to the Max Planck Society and the numerous Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes that existed, both of which would play crucial roles for the Nazis' eugenic-based human experimentation programs. But there's more. If you had Kellogg's cereal earlier this morning for breakfast, you might recognize this guy. John Harvey Kellogg, namesake of Kellogg's cereal, was himself an avid eugenicist. He founded the Race Betterment Foundation in Michigan. Then you had numerous academics of high esteem, such as David Starr Jordan, the first president of Stanford. He was a eugenicist and wrote numerous articles in favor of it. And then you might recognize this guy. This guy is Charles M. Gady, the founder of the very university that you are studying in, the founder of Sac State. Gady was one of the wealthiest men in Sacramento. He also was the founder of the Eugenics Society of Northern California. With this society, he would support numerous eugenics legislations in California. And he also was a massive xenophobe. He hated Mexicans and hated Filipinos. And he also defended Hitler, even when his other colleagues started to distance themselves away from him. Now, eugenics wasn't just some pseudoscience cocked up by a bunch of old cranks. Eugenics has many legacies that in many ways impact us to this day. One of which was this, the IQ test. So the IQ test had its origins in a non-eugenic precursor. This was the Binet-Simon test, developed by the French psychologist Alfred Binet and French psychiatrist Theodore Simon. It sought to measure and predict scholarly performance to best help people succeed in school. Nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's quite noble, to identify ways to help people better succeed and do well in school. Now, much like Galton, these two scientists encountered the whole nature versus nurture debate. They wondered, was intelligence a hereditary trait? Their conclusion was no, it was not. They concluded that environment influenced intelligence, and that practice and education could make one improve their scores. But then, this test would forever gain a eugenic connotation when it was translated into English by Henry H. Goddard. Goddard's version of the Binet-Simon test varied a little bit, because while Binet and Simon argued that one's test score could increase through practice, Godard believed that intelligence was genetically set in stone and that nothing could change one's intelligence. Environment was not a factor, according to Godard, only genetics. Now, in 1912, Godard would publish this book right here, The Kallikak Family. This was Godard's magnus opum, a book that was a supposed extensive case study on the inheritance of feeble-mindedness. And I use big air quotes there. It argued that numerous mental traits, including extremely vaguely defined characteristics like one's morality or poverty or sexuality or criminality, were hereditary and fixed traits. They were not the product of environment, they were fixed traits. Moreover, Godard argued that it was imperative for society to limit the procreative abilities of people deemed undesirable. Simply propping up good blood was not enough. Humanity would have to intervene in nature. Otherwise, society would degenerate rather than improve. So Godard's study centered on this young woman right here. Her name was Deborah Kallikak. Deborah actually did pretty well at sewing clothes and making chairs. However, she did not do well in school, and for that reason she was institutionalized. Godard was interested by Deborah Kallikak, and so he would begin an extensive study on her entire lineage, tracing it all the way back to the American Revolution. Godard traced Deborah's family back to a man he named Martin Kallikak. Martin was a veteran of the American Revolution, with talent and potential. According to Godard, Martin had an affair with a prostitute, bearing a son named the Old Horror. The Old Horror would go on to have more degenerate offspring. Deborah Kallikak, according to Godard, was part of this lineage of the Kallikak family. However, Martin Kallikak also married a well-to-do, worthy Quakeress, and the members of this lineage would include numerous fortunate and upstanding members of society. Oh, my bad. So, the lesson that Godard wants us to learn here is that good blood mixed with good blood creates greater blood, and that bad blood mixed with good or bad blood creates bad blood. And so it is imperative for people to be mating with the right people, and for the wrong people to not mate at all. But now there was a head scratcher. How does one go about identifying the bad blood? Well, that's where this hierarchy right here comes into play. So according to Godard, there was at the top of this hierarchy of intelligence the so-called geniuses of society. These are the people that must mate at all costs. They're the ones who build our roads, push society forward, and bring about social progress. They're the ones that you want in government. They're the ones that you want running businesses. Because as long as the geniuses exist, society will progress. Then, right behind the geniuses, you had so-called normal people. But then you had the bad blood. And this whole table that you see on your right is exclusively consisting of bad blood. So One type of person that Godard deemed to be bad blood were the so-called morons. Godard actually coined the word moron. The word moron did not even exist in the English dictionary. Godard believed that the morons were the most problematic group, not because they were the stupidest of these people, or quote-unquote stupidest people, but because they appeared normal in the sense that they could live on their own and they had some practical skills needed in life. However, their scholastic skills and ability to excel in school were not up to the standards. And for that reason, Godard also called these people the borderline cases. So while they weren't necessarily an imbecile or an idiot, the morons were the most dangerous, because with other people in this chart, like the imbeciles and the idiots, you could easily identify them. But the morons could blend in, and if you're not careful, you might end up accidentally mating with one. And then the child will be a moron because of that. And then if a moron were to mate with another moron, then they might get an imbecile, and then an idiot. So this is how it all starts. It starts with people being unaware of their vices. And then the next thing you know it, you get swamped with incompetence. So it is imperative that every form of bad blood be identified and eliminated. And with that, a man named Louis Termon would invent a term that we would use to this day: intelligence quotient, or IQ. So Termon published the Stanford revision of the Binet-Simon test in 1917. Termon, much like Godard, believed that the feeble-minded, especially the so-called borderline cases, morons, posed a big threat to humanity if left unchecked. And so the IQ test was supposed to be a means of selecting and identifying who exactly qualified as desirable or undesirable. This test would be a helpful tool for excluding certain groups of immigrants, and as a means of identifying which American citizens were to be sterilized against their will. Many other intelligence tests also owe their origins to eugenics. One intelligence test that we still use to this day is the SAT. The SAT was invented by a eugenicist named Carl Brigham. Brigham essentially was a disciple of Godard, and he believed that it was imperative to only let the smartest among us excel in school, and that if you let the wrong people succeed, then you'll get a society that is forever dependent on welfare. And so the SAT also owes its origins to eugenics. So, now that we have a means of identifying them, what mattered now was actually doing something about them. And it is here where the practice of sterilization would take place. So, almost immediately, numerous states across the country, slowly but surely, would pass a eugenic-based sterilization law. Now, when I say sterilization, I am referring to involuntary sterilization, compulsory sterilization. So the first state to pass compulsory sterilization laws was Indiana in 1907. Then, right after Indiana, was Connecticut in 1907, that same year. Then, in 1909, the biggest edition yet would introduce a sterilization law: California. California was the third state to pass a eugenic-based sterilization law, but unlike other states, California would be in a league of its own. Then right behind California was Washington. And slowly but surely, more and more states would pass eugenic-based sterilization laws. Until by 1929, this is what the legality of eugenic-based sterilization would look like. Everything that you see shaded had a eugenic-based sterilization law. So, as impressive as that chart was, words cannot describe just how unique California was when it came to eugenics. California was in a league of its own. 80% of all eugenic-based sterilizations in the country were done in California alone. In 1917, there were 1,422 reported sterilizations in the United States. Of this total, 1,077, or 70%, were in California alone. By 1920, the total number was 3,233. 63% of this was in California. And then between the years 1930 and 1944, the total number of sterilizations done in California climbed up to 11,000. Historians have estimated that from 1909 to 1963, some 20,000 people were sterilized in Californian asylums and hospitals. So, wait, can I... Now, not everyone was buying the whole eugenic grift. Many people rightfully criticized American eugenics. Article after article tore the eugenic methodology to shreds, arguing that it was founded on flawed principles, flawed methodologies, and flawed research. In fact, one of the biggest movies to criticize eugenics is actually one of your assigned films in this class. It's called Tomorrow's Children. Now, Tomorrow's Children does an excellent job at criticizing American eugenics. Initially, the film was deemed controversial and censored even. But then, with the rise of Hitler, the producers of the movie were able to get the ban lifted by arguing, no, we're not criticizing American eugenics, we're criticizing the German one. And so for that reason, the film was able to overturn the censorships. But it wasn't just the so-called liberal left-leaning press that was criticizing American eugenics. No. You know who else was criticizing American eugenics? Other eugenicists were criticizing American eugenics, including supporters of Francis Galton. This was an English eugenicist, a man named Dr. Heron, a supporter of Francis Galton, the man I talked about earlier, who accused Davenport of carelessness, inconsistency, and misinformation, and said that following his advice would mean the death of eugenics as a science. So even by the standards of the time, American eugenics was seen as a little out there. So how did Davenport respond to this criticism from every possible angle? Well, He did what any rational-minded person would do when facing criticism. This is an attack against my reputation, which I regard as of infinitely less importance than the acquisition of truth. And if I were to resent these evil innuendos, it is not for myself at all, but only for the protection of the scientific interests which I am, for the time, custodian. You know, he did what any rational-minded person would do when facing criticism. And so Davenport, facing numerous criticism in all possible fronts, wrote article after article after article responding to criticism, trying to course correct the discourse around eugenics. Shut up, 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 shut up. You're wrong, you're fake news, fake news, fake news, fake news. That was Davenport. Just constantly on PR, public relations alert right now. It was not an easy task to be a eugenicist in America. But as big as all these criticisms were, as big as Tomorrow's Children was, and as big as other eugenicists were in terms of criticism, you want to know what the biggest source of criticism of American eugenics was? The Constitution. This document right here was perhaps one of the biggest obstacles to challenging the legitimacy of eugenics. The Constitution, specifically the clause of due process, was referenced constantly by critics, arguing that the compulsory sterilization laws violated the right to due process. But even the Constitution would soon be overturned in 1927 when Buck versus Bell commenced. This case essentially made it so eugenic sterilizations could trump the Constitution. So Buck versus Bell centered on this young girl right here named Carrie Buck. In order to understand who Carrie Buck is, it is important to understand her lineage. So Carrie Buck was the daughter of this person, Emma Buck. Emma was essentially deemed undesirable, and so she was institutionalized. Because she was deemed a prostitute, and I use that with big air quotes here, because in this time period, anyone could be deemed a prostitute, whether for actually being one or for simply conducting herself in a way that was deemed unacceptable. And furthermore, Emma Buck did not pass an IQ test. And so, Emma Buck would be institutionalized and deemed a moron. Now, shortly before this happened, Emma Buck would give birth to this young girl named Carrie Buck, the plaintiff of Buck versus Bell. Now, after Emma Buck was institutionalized, Carrie Buck was taken in by a man named J.T. Dobbs. So, when Carrie Buck was young, Carrie Buck did pretty well in school. She got really good grades and was overall a so-called normal person. But then, everything changed when Carrie Buck reached her teenage years. Because when she reached her teenage years, she was raped, sexually assaulted by, according to her testimony, the nephew of J.T. Dobbs, her foster father. Now, J.T. Dobbs wanted to hear none of these complaints. And so, Dobbs wanted Carrie Buck and her shame out of the household. And so, because she got raped, she was deemed a moron and was subsequently institutionalized in the same place where her mother was institutionalized, the Virginia State Epileptic Colony. And then, in the year 1924, Carrie Buck gave birth, while still a teenager, to this person, Vivian Buck. And right after Vivian Buck was born, the state of Virginia would pass its eugenic-based sterilization law. And it is here where the case of Buck versus Bell would commence. Now, Buck versus Bell was one of the most unfair Supreme Court cases in American history. And in order to understand why it was unfair, we need to understand how the case was done. Buck versus Bell was unfair not only because of its ruling, but because of the way in which the case was conducted. Because this trial was not a fair trial. So, on the prosecuting side of Buck versus Bell, you had Dr. Albert Priddy, who was the head of the colony that Carrie Buck stayed at. He aggressively pushed to have Carrie Buck and her entire family, including her newborn baby, sterilized against their will. Then, of course, you have the defendant of this case, Carrie Buck, whose mother was deemed a moron due to being labeled as a quote-unquote prostitute, and who herself was deemed a moron due to getting raped as a teenager. Now, like any other court case, Carrie Buck would need a lawyer, and a pretty good lawyer at that. However, Carrie Buck would get one of the worst picks possible, because the person who would be defending Carrie Buck from Dr. Priddy was this guy, Irving Whitehead. Whitehead was no stranger to eugenics, because Whitehead was an avid eugenicist himself. He himself played a major role in sterilizing another family earlier, the so-called Mallory family. So Whitehead technically was on the same side as Dr. Priddy, the man who he'd be defending Carrie Buck against. But it goes even deeper than that, because Whitehead was actually the guy who appointed Priddy to head the Virginia institution that Carrie Buck stayed at. Yet it was Whitehead, the avid eugenicist, who would be defending Carrie Buck from another avid eugenicist. Now, midway through the case, Dr. Priddy passed away due to illness, and so his place would be taken by a man named John H. Bell. And it is with these two people, Carrie Buck versus John H. Bell, that the court case would get its infamous name, Buck versus Bell. The ruling of the case was the following: 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So how did we get to this ruling? Well, let's look at the so-called 3 generations of imbeciles. So, generation of imbeciles number 1, Emma Buck, who as we mentioned earlier, was deemed feeble-minded because she failed an IQ test and was deemed a quote-unquote prostitute. Then you have generation 2 of imbeciles, Carrie Buck, who was deemed feeble-minded because she got raped as a teenager. So who could the 3rd generation be? That would be Vivian, the newborn child born from said rape. So it's important to keep in mind that Vivian Buck was born in the year 1924. Buck versus Bell was happening in the year 1927. So, At this point in time, Vivian Buck would have been around 3 years old. She would have been a toddler when this was all happening. And the eugenicists, wanting to confirm their biases, decided, let's have a 3-year-old toddler take an IQ test. And surprise, surprise, it turned out that Vivian Buck was feeble-minded. There you had it. 3 generations of imbeciles. Could you imagine if there was a 5th generation of imbeciles? Could you imagine if there was a 5th one, a 6th one, a 7th one, an 8th one? No. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or let them starve for imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting open the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And so, Buck versus Bell would set up a very dangerous legal precedent. It denied undesirable women bodily autonomy. It ruled that the states were allowed to dictate what women could do with their own bodies. It also denied undesirable men bodily autonomy, because men who were deemed feeble-minded could also be sterilized against their will. Buck versus Bell was never revoked. Forced sterilization is still legal in America, particularly in prisons and recently in ICE detention centers under Donald Trump. This case was also referenced by the Nazis at Nuremberg as an excuse for their own action, claiming that they were doing the same thing that we were. Here's one Nazi referencing Buck versus Bell verbatim. This is Otto Hoffmann, chief of the SS Race and Settlement Main Office, who was tasked with colonizing Poland and ethnically cleansing all of the Poles there. In a judgment of the US Supreme Court, it says, among other things, it is better for everybody if society, instead of waiting until it has to execute degenerate offspring or leaves them to starve because of their feeble-mindedness, can prevent obviously inferior individuals from propagating their kind. This was a direct quoting of Buck versus Bell. But as crazy as this was, Buck versus Bell is significant because it violated people's bodily autonomy. Speaking of bodily autonomy, how did the feminists react to this? It may surprise you, but many feminists were actually on board with eugenics. For example, Victoria Woodhull was an avid eugenicist. She stated the following: "The best of minds today have accepted that if superior people are desired, they must be bred. And if imbeciles, criminals, paupers, and the otherwise unfit are undesirable, they must not be bred." Then you had the author Charlotte Perkins Gilman, author of The Yellow Wallpaper, but also author of a eugenic utopian novel called Herland, in which women had the power to control the human genome and would ultimately create a master race. One quote that really stuck out to me when I was reading through Herland was this one: "We killed many hopeless degenerates, insane idiots, and real perverts after trying our best powers of cure." And then there was this person, Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood, who argued that certain undesirables, including women, should not have bodily autonomy, and that only women of a desirable type can have bodily autonomy. Sanger was an avid eugenicist and published many books, such as Women and the New Race, and this one, The Pivot of Civilization. Chapter 4, The Fertility of the Feeble-Minded. Eugenics seems to me to be valuable in its critical and diagnostic aspects, in emphasizing the danger of irresponsible and uncontrolled fertility of the unfit, and the feeble-minded establishing a progressive unbalance of human society and lowering the birth rate among the fit. But in its so-called constructive aspect, it's seeking to reestablish the dominance of the healthy strain over the unhealthy by urging an increased birth rate among the fit. The eugenicists really offer nothing more farsighted than a cradle competition between the fit and the unfit. They suggest in very truth that all intelligent and respectable parents should take as their example in this grave matter of childbearing the most irresponsible elements of the community. Chapter 5, The Cruelty of Charity. Fostering the good for nothing at the expense of the good is an extreme cruelty. It is a deliberate storing up of miseries for future generations. There is no greater curse to posterity than that of bequeathing them an increasing population of imbeciles. A direct quote from Herbert Spencer. Sanger herself writes, "Those vast, complex, interrelated organizations aiming to control and diminish the spread of misery and destitution and all of the menacing evils that spring out of this sinisterly fertile soil are the surest sign that our civilization has bred, is breeding, and is perpetuating constantly increasing numbers of defectives, delinquents, and dependents. My criticism, therefore, is not directed at the failure of philanthropy, but rather at its success." This would be a persistent problem throughout much of the history of birth control. Even after eugenics itself was losing popularity, it was not uncommon for black women specifically to be forced into abortions, or when I say abortions, I mean risky, dangerous abortions, not like the abortion practices that we have now, which are much more safe, but they were financially pressured to these sort of practices under the threat of losing welfare. One infamous example of this was Norplant. As Judy Norsegian of the National Women's Health Network best put it, Norplant is a contraceptive that's controlled by the provider, not the woman. One Norplant recipient recalled, "I really did not want it, but after I had my baby, they came in my room and asked me to look at the educational movie. They put my Norplant in the day I had my little girl. They just kept hassling me." Here's another Norplant recipient recalling being manipulated into getting a Norplant. "They were telling me, 'What are you going to do for birth control? Are you going to get a Norplant? It's good. Medicaid will pay for that to go in, you know.' I had a week to figure out what I was going to do, so I just jumped on that." Here is a physician's directive issued by the state of Oklahoma disclosing the government's purpose of coercing poor women to remain on Norplant for as much as possible. "It is not the intent of the department to cover the removal of the Norplant system prior to the expiration of 5 years, unless there is documented medical necessity. Payment is not intended to be made for the removal of the contraceptive, for the convenience of the patient, minor menstrual irregularities, or for the purpose of conception." Here's David H. Glass a Mississippi representative, on his stance for family cap laws in 1958. During the year 1957, there were born out of wedlock in Mississippi more than 7,000 black children and about 200 white children. The black woman, because of child welfare assistance, is making it a business. In some cases, have given birth to illegitimate children. The purpose of my bill was to try to stop or slow down such traffic at its source. Now, my criticism of this side of birth control has nothing to do with the fact that I am pro-life. It has everything to do with the fact that I am pro-choice. As Betsy Hartman best described it, the population control and anti-abortion philosophies, although diametrically opposed, share one thing in common. They are both anti-choice. Population control advocates impose contraception and sterilization on women. The so-called right to life movement denies women the basic right of access to abortion and birth control. Neither takes the interests and rights of the individual women as their starting point. Both approaches attempt to control women instead of letting women control their bodies themselves. Now, the right-wingers love to bring this side of birth control up in order to justify their own program of denying bodily autonomy. Except in this case, the right-wingers love to deny women the right of access to abortion. But you want to know one thing the right-wingers love to leave out of the debate? And that is this, that immigration law owes its existence to many eugenic policies. Now, America has a long history of xenophobia. But it would become particularly bad with the rise of eugenics, because with the rise of eugenics came one of the most xenophobic laws in our country's history. The Immigration Act of 1924, also called the Johnson-Reed Act. This law established in effect for the first time a new category, the illegal alien, and with it came the Border Patrol, charged with policing the boundaries of the United States and empowered to arrest and deport people who enter the country illegally. This term was later associated almost exclusively with Latino people. Illegal aliens at first referred mainly to Southern and Eastern Europeans who tried to sneak across the border from Mexico or Canada into America. So, this bill was the brainchild of many eugenic xenophobes, such as this guy, Madison Grant, author of The Passing of the Great Race. He suggested that the great Nordic race was at risk of being replaced by lesser races if we did not impose strict immigration quotas. So influential was Madison Grant that he not only influenced American eugenicists, but even the Nazis. Adolf Hitler, dictator of Germany, even called Grant's book his Bible, and he even wrote fan mail to Madison Grant, where he personally thanked him for writing the book in the first place. Then you had this guy, Lothrop Stoddard, author of The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. He also argued that the white race was being replaced by colored groups. He feared the possibility of what right-wingers today would call white genocide. Then you had this guy, Henry Pratt Fairchild, author of The Melting Pot Mistake. He argued that the notion of the American melting pot was a terrible idea, for it would lead to a great replacement of white people. Then you have our own university's founder, Charles M. Gady. He wrote extensively about the perils posed by Filipino immigrants. Now I say immigrant in quotes because the Philippines was technically an American colony back then. He also wrote extensively about the threats posed by Mexicans. But for the sake of simplicity, let us focus on who I believe to be the most important xenophobe, Madison Grant. I will argue that Madison Grant was essentially the brain behind the Johnson-Reed Act. Let us read some excerpts of his book. Two races in the long run gives us a race reverting to the more ancient, generalized, and lower type. The cross between a white man and an Indian is an Indian. The cross between a white man and a black person is a black person. The cross between a white man and a Hindu is a Hindu. And the cross between any of the three European races and a Jew is a Jew. It has taken us 50 years to learn that speaking English, wearing good clothes, and going to school and church does not transform a black person into a white man. Nor was a Syrian or Egyptian freedman transformed into a Roman by wearing a toga and applauding his favorite gladiator in the amphitheater. We shall have a similar experience with the Polish Jew, whose dwarf stature, peculiar mentality, and ruthless concentration on self-interest are being engrafted upon the stock of the nation. With the pathetic and fatuous belief in the efficacy of American institutions and environment to reverse or obliterate immemorial hereditary tendencies, these newcomers were welcomed and given a share in our landed prosperity. The American taxed himself to sanitate and educate these poor helots, and as soon as they could speak English, encouraged them to enter into political life, first in municipalities, and then of the nation. The result is showing plainly the rapid decline in the birth rate of Native Americans, white Americans that is, not American Indians, because the poorer classes of colonial stock, where they still exist, will not bring children into the world to compete in the labor market with the Slovak, the Italian, the Syrian, and the Jew. The Native American, the white American, is too proud to mix socially with them, and is gradually withdrawing from the scene, abandoning to these aliens the land which he conquered and developed. The man of the old stock is being crowded out of many country districts by these foreigners, just as he is today being literally driven off the streets of New York City by the swarms of Polish Jews. These immigrants adopt the language of the Native American. They wear his clothes, they steal his name, and they are beginning to take his women, but they seldom adopt his religion or understand his ideals. And while he is being elbowed out of his own home, the American looks calmly abroad and urges on others the suicidal ethics which are exterminating his own race. And so the Johnson-Reed Act would be passed, bringing an end to the American melting pot. So prior to the Johnson-Reed Act, this is what immigration flow from Europe looked like. But then, when the Johnson-Reed Act came into law, here's what immigration flow would look like from Europe. Notice how the two countries least impacted by these quotas were Germany and Britain. That is because Germany and Britain had what was called the Nordic race, and the Nordic race was considered the master race. And one group that would be impacted by the Johnson-Reed Act were Jewish people. So, prior to the Holocaust, here's what the Jewish population distribution of Europe looked like. Notice how Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and all of Eastern Europe, notice how this area has the largest concentration of Jews in Europe. Now, because of the Johnson-Reed Act, mass immigration from Eastern Europe would be severely quoted. Now, it'd be such a shame if every single Jew in Eastern Europe had to flee from an impending genocide. Oh. Yeah. So, the vast majority of deaths in the Holocaust occurred in Eastern Europe. You can think of Eastern Europe like the hot spot of the Holocaust. And it is also in Eastern Europe where most of the Jews lived. But that would forever change because those same Jews would be killed en masse. And so many of these Jews decided to flee to other countries, one of which being America. But America rejected more Jews than had accepted them. I was going to show you here's a little question. Which country during the Evian Conference decided to admit Jews during the Holocaust? The Dominican Republic. Now, I was going to show you this video, but unfortunately I can't get it to play. This video was a video showing the tragic story of the MS St. Louis, a ship full of Jewish refugees fleeing from the Nazis. This ship arrived at Havana Harbor and was trying to get permission to dock and get people to enter the United States through Florida. Immigration authorities rejected all of them. And so the ship, having sailed all the way from Europe, had to immediately turn away and sail back towards Europe, back to the place they were trying to flee from. And many of the Jews on this ship were killed by the Nazis because they were rejected from entering safe countries. And America was one of those countries that said no. Now, certain provisions of the Johnson-Reed Act have been rolled back. The Johnson-Reed Act would remain the big law of immigration until 1965. Yet, certain provisions of the Johnson-Reed Act remained intact even after the act was repealed. For example, the system of visas remained a big part of immigration law well into the present day. Prior to the Johnson-Reed Act, people did not need a visa to enter the country, but now they did. And these visas tended to be very expensive. So if you were a Jewish refugee fleeing the Holocaust, you would need to get a visa just to enter the country. And here's the thing you must understand about Jewish people during this time. Many Jewish people had no money on them because in order to leave Germany, they had to pay the Germans much of their life savings simply to immigrate from Germany. Now you have to pay an obscene amount of money that you didn't have to immigrate into America, which was often not realistic. But there was another big legacy of the Johnson-Reed Act, and that was the establishment of the Border Patrol. This was the first formal U.S. Border Patrol to exist. Today, this group is known by a different name: U.S. Customs and Border Protection, under Homeland Security. And so, with the Johnson-Reed Act came the birth of the modern U.S.-Mexico border. Lots of people in lines waiting their turn. Unsanitary conditions. But back then, it was somehow even more dehumanizing because Mexican people were seen as dirty. And so they would have to go through these extremely dehumanizing delousing procedures. This was happening even during the Bracero program. And so Mexican people were forced to take off all of their clothes, strip naked, and then shave all of their hair off in order to clear for entry. But even then, they were not done being sanitized, because then they were sprayed in the face with pesticides. And furthermore, these Mexican migrants also had to bathe in kerosene. And sometimes a Border Patrol agent might throw a match in while they were doing so. And this was so dehumanizing that one Latina girl had enough and decided to revolt. This was Carmelita Torres. And I honestly can't blame her. If I were forced to go through this procedure all the time, I'd probably riot as well. And this practice was so dehumanizing that it actually inspired Nazi scientists. Because much like how we viewed the Mexicans as dirty people, the Nazis viewed the Jews as dirty people. And the Jewish prisoners in concentration camps would have to go through the same dehumanizing delousing procedure. Except their delousing procedure was somehow even more dehumanizing than the United States. Now, the picture you see right there, that was actually a picture I took myself. I actually visited the Mauthausen concentration camp, and I was taken aback from the horrors. The picture you see right above is a picture of the delousing chamber at the El Paso Ciudad Juarez border crossing between America and Mexico. Then you had this. This is the women's disinfection room at the El Paso Ciudad Juarez border crossing. Then you have this, the disinfection room at the Mauthausen concentration camp. And again, I actually took a picture of this when I visited the camp. And if you guys still think I'm just drawing conclusions to where there are none, there are more direct instances in which American immigration policy inspired the Nazis. Look down below. You see that picture right there? You're probably wondering why I'm zooming in there. That is because those cans that those people are holding are Zyklon B. And this was not at this was not at a Nazi concentration camp. This was at a border crossing at New Orleans. These same chemicals, Zyklon B, were used on Mexican immigrants as well. But they would also be used en masse for the Holocaust. And Zyklon B is actually much more infamous for its use in the Holocaust. Even Hitler himself admired American racist policies. As he wrote in Mein Kampf, he stated, "There is currently only one state in which one can observe at least weak beginnings of a better conception of rights. This is, of course, not our exemplary German Republic, but the American Union. The American Union categorically refuses the immigration of physically unhealthy elements and simply excludes the immigration of certain races. In these respects, America already pays obeisance, at least in tentative form, to the characteristic Volkisch conception of the state." Hitler himself admired American eugenics. But it wasn't just Hitler who was inspired by American eugenics. Other key thinkers of the German eugenics movement were inspired by American eugenics, such as Alfred Ploetz, father of German eugenics. He studied abroad in America and was deeply impressed with its racial laws. And he would form the Archiv für Rasse und Gesellschaftsbiologie, or the German Society for Racial Hygiene. He coined the word Rassenhygiene, or racial hygiene, in German. Co-founding the German Society of Racial Hygiene was this guy, Eugen Fischer. Eugen Fischer committed horrifying experiments on the Herero and Nama prisoners in German South Africa. He would take their heads, collect them, preserve them, and use them as anthropological proof that black people were equivalent to apes. And I say that with big air quotes. Now, Eugen Fischer was a close colleague of Charles Davenport. Then you had this Austro-Hungarian eugenicist, Gissa von Hoffmann, who wrote Die Rassenhygiene in den Vereinigten Staaten von Nordamerika, or Racial Hygiene in the United States, praising American eugenics and urging other European countries to follow America's example. And then, of course, you have Adolf Hitler, who was inspired by all of these other German eugenicists and was himself a massive fan of Madison Grant's Passing of the Great Race. Now, let's fast forward a little bit. So, it is currently 1933. Adolf Hitler has assumed chancellorship and has become dictator in Germany. Almost immediately, Hitler would enact numerous eugenic policies, such as this one, the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring. This law was modeled after Harry Laughlin's sterilization laws, specifically his Virginia law, and this law sought to sterilize undesirables. Then, immediately after, in 1935, you had the Reich Citizenship Law, one of the two Nuremberg laws. This law declared that only Aryans, or Nordics, could qualify for German citizenship. Then at this exact same time, you had another law, the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor. It stripped Jews of citizenship and defined anyone who had one drop of Jewish blood. So not only would full-blooded Jews be targeted by the Nazis, but even Jews who had half Jewish blood, people who had a quarter Jewish blood, people who had 1/8 Jewish blood, 1/16 Jewish blood, or just one teeny tiny drop. This law was modeled after Jim Crow's one drop rule, which stated that any person who had so much as one drop of African American blood was himself an African American. Oh, my bad. Now, when this was all happening, American eugenicists were extremely envious of the Germans because American eugenics took years to do. It took years of lobbying, years of pressuring Congress, years of court cases. It was an exhausting battle for America. But Germany was able to catch up to America in just 1 year. And by the year 1939, Germany would go to territory that America could only dream of. Because by the year 1939, not only were the Germans sterilizing defective blood, they were outright killing them. America had not even reached this point yet. As Joseph Desjardins best put it, the Germans are beating us at our own game. Many people praised German eugenics. Here are some reactions to the 1935 sterilization law. While we were pussyfooting around, the Germans were calling a spade a spade. If Hitler succeeds in his wholesale sterilization, it will be a demonstration that will carry eugenics farther than 100 eugenic societies could. If he makes a fiasco of it, it will set the movement back where 100 eugenic societies can never resurrect it. Nothing is so distinctive in Nazi Germany as its ideas about race. Its concept of racial matters underlies the whole National Socialist philosophy of life and profoundly influences both its policies and practices. We cannot intelligently evaluate the Third Reich unless we understand this basic attitude of mind. The last 20 years witnessed two stupendous forward movements, one in our United States and the other in Germany. When Hitler signed his decrees, California had led all of the world in sterilization operations. Today, even California's quarter-century record has, in 2 years, been outdistanced by Germany. You will be interested to know that your work has played a powerful part in shaping the opinions of the group of intellectuals who are behind Hitler in this epoch-making program. Everywhere I sense that their opinions have been tremendously stimulated by American thought, and particularly by the work of the Human Betterment Foundation. I want you, my dear friend, to carry this thought with you for the rest of your life, that you have really jolted into action a great government of 60 million people! Woo! So American eugenicists were jealous of the Germans because there's only so much racist and eugenic-based legislation that you could pass in a democratic country. Because in a democratic country, you had to deal with incompetent congressmen who just won't listen to you. You have to deal constantly with a free press that criticizes you, who challenges you, who objects to you. Imagine if America was a dictatorship, these racists argue. And so, many people in America turned to fascism. You had groups like the Ku Klux Klan, who argued that America must remain a Herrenvolk democracy. That is, a democracy ruled by one racial group, and one racial group only, white people. But then you had this group, the Black Legion, a splinter faction from the KKK. It operated from 1925 to 1937. It committed acts of terrorism against blacks and were regarded as so violent that they were even deemed more violent than the KKK itself. They had 100,000 members. Then with the rise of Hitler, you see the rise of people trying to emulate German fascism, such as this group right here, the Silver Legion of America, aka the Silver Shirts, named after Hitler's brown shirts and Benito Mussolini's black shirts. They operated from 1933 to 1941, and they believed that Jews were possessed by demons, and they sought to bring about a spiritual renewal of America. They had 15,000 members. And then finally, you had this group, the German-American Bund, sponsored directly by the Nazis. They held an infamous Nazi rally in Madison Square, New York. They plotted to overthrow American democracy and build a Nazi puppet state. They had 25,000 members. Oh, wait. And with that, I thank you all for your time. I hope you learned something new, and have a great rest of your day.